off as contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Cognitive Dissonance Podcast. In this episode, Kristy and I discuss social incentives, how we modify our behaviors to fit in groups, impulse control and exposure therapy, and we also have a pretty exciting exploration into ADHD, how it affects people, and how patterns of behavior and hobbies that we engage in, such as social media, might exacerbate anything there. We also talk self-diagnoses and the pernicious effect that most studies suggest social media use can have on mental health, especially here in the West. It was a really fun episode. We did a lot of prep work for it. I hope y'all enjoy.
Yeah, I think one of the hard parts is correlation does not equal causation, and there's a lot of correlation to work through. And then you just kind of have to suss out what is actually related and what just happened at the same time, because there's a lot of factors. But yeah, that's something I have to constantly remind myself because who knows why all of this is happening now at the same time. It might be completely unrelated.
Well, and that's true. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind that discusses the apparent increasing fragility in the Western psyche. And they do point at a couple main factors, but for the most part, their conclusion is hey, it's a panoply of stuff that we're all dealing with that makes the perfect storm to create X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I recently listened to a podcast about behavioral contracts, or it's a method to reduce behavior that you don't want to see. And one of the issues that they have is that kids have free access, and adults have free access to everything that they love basically at all times. And if you don't, it's a $20 Uber Eats, which, so basically saying how do we discipline, how do we control ourselves if we always have access to the videos that we like, the people that we like, the tweets and attention and likes. And it's really tough if it's just coming in. You lose motivation because you don't have to work for anything. Why would I go to the grocery store when I can just sit in my car and someone brings it to me? And you can really simplify your life down to the bare minimum on accident, and then wonder why you're stagnant and sad and bored, but you've done something with every second of your day. And it was a great, the recommendation is that if you have children, you have to take away their toys. And if you're an adult, you have to, or if they're a teenager, you have to take away the things that they like so that you can give it back to them at the right time, which nobody wants to do. Even to me, it doesn't sound very good.
No, so. and that's the thing. And for our listeners, we'll get into some of the studies that we read and more pointed explanation of the topic we're exploring today. But it does seem to me that the prevailing, I don't want to say decline because I don't want to stigmatize anything unnecessarily, but I'm going to use decline because I can't think of a better word right now. The prevailing decline in mental health in Western countries, right? Because it's not just United States. Canada is exhibiting similar symptoms. The United Kingdom's exhibiting similar symptoms. To a degree, France, Australia, New Zealand, right? These countries with the Western Republic democracy framework are exhibiting a similar patterns of decline in mental health, primarily increases in anxiety disorders, depression, schizoid personality disorder, things of that nature.
Yeah, if I had to put my finger on the one thing that's changed, it's that we live in surplus and there's not a way to make everyday things rewarding anymore because it comes so easily and so quickly. So if, doing your coffee takes time and you have to do it by hand and you grind the beans and it's multi-steps, then you get one reward at the end, your cup of coffee. And it takes a little bit of work and it adds some structure to your day.
Well, and I think too, that's a really good point that you bring up. By embedding rewards in routines, what are you doing at a neurophysiological level? Right? You're conditioning those pathways, right? That's why people always say it's the process, not the product, that I find value in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ask any smoker or any coffee addict that's like a connoisseur that hand grinds their coffee beans, right? It's part of that process that builds up the expectation of the reward. Whereas if they didn't have that process, they would still get the reward, right? Nicotine would hit your brain and it would still dump things the same way. But they're also conditioning themselves to be more responsive to that reward too. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, because there are, like, I could take a 100 milligram caffeine pill, or I could have a cup of coffee that takes me, a couple of minutes to make and boil the water and all that. And in our heads, immediately you knee jerk and say drinking coffee is better than just taking the pill. Taking the pill is too easy. It's going to mess you up. You can't do things that quickly. We know sort of instinctively that it's better to do some things the old fashioned way and not take the easy route out and just take a caffeine pill in the morning. And it's because we know that it's really helpful to have that structure and that work and that routine with the reward at the end versus absolutely no work and only the reward, which is caffeine.
And I think that's a perfect segue into completing our exploration of social media. So part 2, I think it will be beneficial to focus on social media in, we'll call it neurodivergence, if we want to hone it a little bit and just strictly speak ADHD, but we can also talk anxiety and depression because there's evidence that those neurotypicalities are exacerbated by social media as well. But just to tie it back to what we were talking about, right? Coffee versus that caffeine pill. What then happens when we can do that instant gratification with social interaction? How are we neglecting process over product in that? And then what effect is that having on us?
It's certainly a perfect analogy that we would go to someone's house, knock on the door, face a little bit of rejection, or face the possibility of rejection, put a lot of time and work into getting ready. In the 1800s, it took forever to put on all your clothes, and we've gone easier, cheaper, faster with every part of how we look, how we dress ourselves, and how we socially interact with each other. And there's a point where you have to have a little bit of resistance and you have to have a little bit of unpleasantness. Otherwise, you're just getting all reward, no work, and your brain is just going to melt.
Yeah, that reminds me, yesterday or the day before, I had to play behavioral therapist with one of my students. She was having a bad day for a number of different reasons that I'm not going to go into, partly because I don't air other people's business if I can avoid it, and the other part because it's not particularly germane to the point. The point is that I found myself having to re-emphasize to a 15-year-old that you don't appreciate the sunshine without a couple rainy days. Mm-hmm. Or vice versa, right? If rain's your thing, you don't appreciate the rainy days without a couple days of sunshine, right? It is that contrast, both literally and metaphorically, that allows us to perceive opposites, antitheses, right? We have to have a low so we know what it is to have a high. We have to have a win so that way we know what it is to have a loss by comparison.
Yeah. And it's tough because we want especially like children, you want them to be happy and have the things that they like and have things to look forward to. And you want to protect them from disappointment and rejection and hunger and boredom and all of those things. And I feel like right now we can protect them from all of that to their detriment versus letting them learn what it's like to go to a friend's house and be told, no, they don't want to see you, face that rejection, and then go home and move on with your life, hopefully having learned something. And that's not applicable to everything. And obviously there's a happy medium. If you disappoint your child every single day, they're going to hate you. So you got to find that right medium where you're benefiting them without, torturing them. Which
it takes balance, because I think you hit the nail on the head there, mentioning that for relatively the first time in the long epic of human history, we have enough. We have enough food. We have enough time, moderately speaking. We have enough energy, right? So we can make sure that our children are protected on all fronts, but we oftentimes lose sight of at the cost of what, right? And I find myself reapproaching a lot of and I don't want to turn this preachy or anything like that, because this is an exploration creative outlet podcast, but turning back to some of the stuff that we were exposed to in our youth, right? So our unique family upbringing, being raised in a Catholic household, a practicing Catholic household, that old adage, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he can eat for his whole life. I think you could make a very persuasive argument, rooted in evidence, right, not just sophistry, that we as a Western society, primarily American society, we're giving out too much fish, and we're not teaching enough people how to fish.
Yeah, there's twice now in the past week, this has been on my mind, that I've had parents report that their child doesn't drink water, they only drink X. And in my head, I'm like, they will drink water. They're gonna. All you have to do is not give them X, and they will get thirsty and they will drink water. But even that is too much to ask for some parents. And I bring children into it because it's a really easy way to imagine you want this person to be happy, but adults are doing the exact same thing in every area of their lives. I feel like it's just a little bit simpler to explain using children as the example. But yeah, this parent was like, they only drink water with Crystal Light in it. And it's like, you started that and now it's a huge problem. Like they weren't born drinking that, and now they do. And now we're looking for ways to get them off of it. And the answer is you have to disappoint them and say, no, we're drinking water today. And you can do it cold turkey, or you could do it little by little, but feels like a really huge deal when it's a self-made problem. And that's just an example, but it's applicable to
and see, we've known this, and this is what keeps drawing me back to the religious texts, not because I'm trying to be preachy or convince anybody to adhere to any particular type of religion or the other, but there is wisdom there. There's a reason why all of these texts, from whatever denomination or whatever affiliation you like, the Quran, the Old Hebrew Testament, the New King James Bible, right? Yeah. The New Testament, all of that stuff. Like there's a reason that all of that is hung around, because there is value and wisdom in it, even if you don't adhere to its doctrinal beliefs. So, for example, I was listening to a podcast the other day about a psychologist talking about the book of Exodus in the Bible. And to sum it all up, and I might mischaracterize or misremember because I haven't personally read Exodus in like nearly my entire life. So, but we all know the story, right? Moses is in Egypt with all of his people. The Hebrews are slaves to the Egyptians. They have the 7 plagues that, not to use the same term again, but the plagues that plague Egypt, parts the Red Sea. All the Jews leave out into the desert, and what happens to them? God blesses them by having them be like infested with venomous snakes. So after months or years in the desert, being beset by venomous snakes at basically every turn, the Jews are like, "Hey, Moses, go talk to God, because apparently you and him have that connection, right? And like, ask him what's up with the snakes." And the way that the podcast explained God's response, my first thought was, that's exposure therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what he was told to do was to make a bronze cast statue of the snake, place it atop a staff, and all those who look at the staff are now immune to the snake's venom. Right. So you're still going to get bit. Right. There's still going to be pain in life. There's snakes everywhere. And we all know that. Same thing with Adam and Eve in the garden. Even in the Garden of Paradise, snakes got in, right? That's a very apt metaphor for that. We are going to have tragedy and trauma that we have to deal with in life. But the best solution is to expose yourself incrementally to face that than it is to try and expel it and get the instant gratification, immediate reward, pleasure receptors going off in the brain. Right. We have to face down what it is that disrupts us, so that way we can surmount it. If we run away, we don't gain any of the skills to surmount it, and we're still behest to it. Right. And I was like, oh my God, that's exposure therapy. Right. So if that story hasn't been realistically altered in 2,000 years, then we're talking about 2,000 years ago's people's understanding of exposure therapy and how to battle that, which just freaking blows my mind.
Yeah, the people haven't changed, and there's like today, the specific excess that I think is on everyone's mind is social media and internet and that global connection. But 200 years ago, there was something else that was causing this same issue. And because that's what we've done as people, is we've made it easier and more instant. So we started living in towns so that we were all together, and we started making grocery stores instead of foraging because that was faster as well. And all of these have been improvements. Yeah, it's tough because I don't want to criticize us for making our lives this easy, but now we just have a different problem than having to go and find stuff.
Yeah, well, the way I explain it to my students is, depending on where you start the clock at, we have anywhere from 100,000 years to like 3 million years of evolution driving our instinctual habits, right? Think of stage fright. Why is stage fright a thing? Well, because 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, if you were in front center stage of a whole bunch of people you didn't know, chances are you were going to get killed. Right?
Pretty unsafe.
Realistically speaking, go back farther than that. Go 300,000 years ago to when we were hunter-gatherers, and if you ran into someone you didn't know, like, they legitimately could have killed and eaten you. Right? You could have been slain in the forest, never seen again, and your whole family was like, I wonder what happened to Uncle Jeff. And then you come up with a myth about it. This is why you stay close to the pack, because you wander off and you get swallowed by the earth or whatever. Right. So, and it's that very deeply rooted in our reptilian part of the brain instinct to be cautious around people we don't know that drives that anxiety. The issue is, and that's just one example, the issue is we have a whole panoply of those evolutionary characteristics in a world that's changing and adapting faster than our evolution can keep up. right? So we have
Yes.
all of these systems with social media. We have the grocery store as an example, right? Yes, it's more efficient. It makes our lives easier, but also what is it? It's the communal general store, right? It would be the same way as the root cellar in our hunter-gatherer days. And we all as a community flock there to get our food and flock back, right? We still have those innate fundamental characteristics and behaviors that we inherited through evolution that we follow. But things are changing faster than what we can keep up with. And, we have no clue how that's going to affect us 2 generations from now.
Correct. I think most people's inclination is that it's going to lead to be blunt, very fat people with tooth decay who are very inactive and constantly on their phones. If you asked like a doctor, what's going to happen to people in 20 years and in 200 years? Probably the same thing that's happening now, unless there's more changes. And the other issue is what you find rewarding and what you don't find rewarding. And staying on your phone for an hour is more rewarding for some people than going to exercise or taking a walk around the park or going to the public library. And you can't expect people to go do those things if the reward is already right there in front of them. Because why would you? We're not really designed to do that. Once you have it, then, we're like lions. After you get your reward, you lay down and digest and rest for the day, and then you go out and hunt again.
Well, yeah, because we've forgotten that life is a game of gaining more calories than you're expending.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you were to reduce life on Earth down to a single statement, that is it. Everything else that we have, at least from the scientific perspective, is strictly that, to help us be more efficient in gaining more calories than we are expending.
Yeah. And this was also coming from, I can't remember the last time where I was genuinely bored with nothing to do. Cannot remember. I've always had my phone, it feels like. And if I don't have my phone, I have a book, I have my watch. There's always been something there. So not trying to shake my finger and talk as an outsider, I haven't been bored my entire life. I've always had my phone and always had that instant reward.
Yeah, and that's something that I remind my students all the time, because I get on my soapbox a lot. I do find myself playing motivational coach, behavioral therapist, cognitive coach almost more often than I'm playing educator now, and not because I want to, right? Because I don't want to meddle with these kids' development any more than establishing healthy norms of theft and violence are not the right answer. But I do they're struggling behaviorally, psychosocially, and I make it a point, and I probably do it way more than what they want to hear, to remind them that I'm not immune to any of the criticism I have of your guys' behaviors or the motivations behind those behaviors. I'm just as susceptible to them as you guys are. The difference is I have enough maturity to be able to slow down and self-reflect in the moment. And more often than not, the reason why I have all this wisdom, and I can guarantee that if you're doing X and you're getting Y, that if you change X, you'll get something different than Y, is because I've been stuck in that loop too. I've made those same mistakes or those same piss poor decisions, and I saw how it affected me. I saw how it affected my friends, my family, whatever, when they went through it too. And I'm just trying to save you a step.
Yeah, I think the self-awareness comes with age, and it comes from it being modeled for you and seeing other people do it, which is why it's important to talk about. I mean, we have to talk about it. Otherwise, people will just, go on with their bad selves and just wonder why it must be America. Like,
I
it
mean,
must be, just this day and age. But
we
you
are
can get down and
dialogical.
figure it out.
Yeah, we are dialogical creatures, right? Even when we're alone, what do we do to self-reflect on behaviors? We talk to ourselves, right? We have our internal dialogue. Sometimes those thoughts manifest as pictures or colors or feelings or something like that, right? Not every brain works the same, but for the most part is roughly interpreted as communication, language inside your head, right? How I engage most of the arguments that I have with people in the real world is after I've simulated the same argument like a dozen or so times in my own head. And 9 times out of 10, because I'm self-aware and mature enough now, I realize that as a trained historian, I recognize that there's always 2 sides to every story. So literally anything that I could say to make my case in this argument can be negated in some way, shape, or form. So save everybody some headache. And don't be rash and engage in the argument for no reason.
Right. Because we do learn through stories and seeing other people do it. And it's helpful. Yeah. All this to say, you have to talk to kids about those tough topics because they're not just going to absorb it any other way.
And they need to talk
to
to each other, and they have to be modeled that healthy conversation and debate behavior because they don't do it themselves. They're pretty terrible to each other. But then also too, what happens when you remove that interpersonal media and replace it with distanced digital media? Right. We can still have our dialogues. We can still have our conversations online and social media, but it's more along the lines of text conversations, which means a lot of nuance is lost, tone is lost. We assume and have to infer a whole lot more. Right. So I guess you could make the argument that we're training the next generation to assume before they even listen to somebody's response, what their response is going to be or what their meaning is behind it. But also too, all of the natural inhibitions that would slow somebody down and make them respond differently if they were in a face-to-face situation, they are no longer subject to in the social media world. You say something wrong, worst that happens is you get blocked. You get a 24-hour lockout of your account because Twitter says, boo, you used a bad word. Right? In my days, if I was in middle school and I wanted to use a racial epithet or I wanted to call somebody something, like I had to count my teeth first because they pop me, and they're kind of removed from that except for what they consume in popular culture about how people mistakenly use aggression and will to power to dominate in those scenarios. Because that's what most popular culture is, right? Everything from pop music all the way to, the teenage drama TV shows. That's what they're getting. That they're not getting modeled healthy interactions in the media that they're consuming, and they don't have a way to practice healthy interactions and conflict resolutions through social media.
Yeah. I think that practice piece is underrated too. Like, you have to know what the skills are, see someone else do them, which helps you know what they are. And then that's not enough. You have to actually do them and then figure out that worked, that didn't work, and then try again. And that piece is sort of where the working for your reward comes into play, and being set up for failure or being set up for rejection or all of those things that we don't want. And it has to be done in a safe place at an appropriate age. And a lot of times that starts with, playing as little children on the playground and those social interactions. And there's a whole group of 7-year-olds who the last time that they played with another kid was when they were 4, before the pandemic. And now they're bigger, they're stronger, and they haven't had any practice for years. And
Yeah,
you could tell.
There's that. I've noticed from my own observations, though, that for the most part, obviously, there's the exception to every rule, so I don't want to overgeneralize. But on the whole, the age group that's going to be most affected by this, and I've been doing a lot of discussion about this with my fellow educators at my high school, about whether there is anything that we can do, or if all we can do is run mitigation, and this is going to be like the 2020s lost generation, right? Like the oversurplus of kids with undersurplus of male figures after World War I and World War II, right? That kind of lost generation where there's just nothing you can do about it except mitigate. And I think it's those that were between the ages of like 10 and 14 when the pandemic first hit, right? So they would be those that are pushing 16 now at the upper end. Those that are in probably 7th grade now at the lower end, because I noticed my own kids, at least the younger ones, and even the older ones too. The older two were already developed enough through what I call the adolescent formative years, right? Those middle school years where you're really starting to catalyze the foundation for your identity, who you think you are, who you feel like, rather than just the first couple years where you're just told X, Y, and Z, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, I'm gonna go with it because I just want to play with bubbles and puddles. Right. So, they were old enough to have that, so they were flexible and they could bounce back. My younger kids, they were those bubbles and puddles, right? What's William's favorite things? What does it mean to be William? Well, he likes Minecraft. He likes Fortnite. He likes to shoot his brother with Nerf guns. He likes to play baseball. And that's it. Like, that's the extent of it. That's as far as he goes. He might starting to be having and formulating his hopes and dreams, but it's really easy. It's still cool for him to stay home and play with his brothers and play with his parents and stuff like that. He's not going to get bullied at school because of it. So he's been relatively well adjusted for the pandemic. But that middle age group, right? That 13-year-old teenage angst where like you feel like you'll literally die if you can't go to your friend's house like you convinced yourself you should be able to because your parents said no and you didn't formulate that into your plan. You have that huge cognitive dissonance and your whole conception of the world breaks down because now you're not getting what you want. That age group has been so stunted in their psychosocial development that, and correct me if I'm wrong psychologically about any of this, but we know the evidence suggests you don't skip steps in your psychological development, right? So we know a couple things. Psychological development and stages are a real thing. Where the boundaries are, how we qualify them, right? That's all a little loosey-goosey still. You can go to Erickson and get one answer. You can go to Piaget and get a different answer, right? But they loosely correlate that younger, simpler, concrete, older, abstract, things get weird. So we don't skip. We know that the stages are a thing. We know that we don't skip steps. So you're not in a concrete operational phase and go straight to the formative. You have those in-between steps where you're like half and half. Right? Where like I can take Orion and I can give him 2 square blocks. And he can look at it and I can say this is a square. 2 of them together, 1 + 1 makes 2, right? He has those manipulatives. He has that concrete example. William, I can take one of them away and I can give him 1. Now he's got a reference point and I can say, what happens if you have 2 or 3? And he can conceptualize those abstract forms, right? But he still can't do multiplication in his head. He's not quite there yet. Gage, he's 16. I can say what's 3 × 3. Even if he doesn't have it memorized, he can just close his eyes, see 9 glowing dots, 3 rows of 3, count them, and be like, oh yeah, it's 9. Doesn't need any manipulatives whatsoever because he can do that. But this lost generation, as I call them, they're in situations where they're doing driver's ed. And psychosocially, they're at the developmental level of a 7th grader because that was their last normal year of school.
Mm-hmm.
All they've been able to do the past couple years for remote schooling is create a false conception of the world on social media and then go out with their peers and run the streets, who their peers also think that that false conception of the world is accurate. So they're getting peer feedback on disillusioned, incorrect analysis of reality, to where like they have created this whole chaotic reality for themselves. And am I making sense? I feel that was a really big hula hoop just to get back and say they don't know what they're doing and they're too stunted in growth.
Yeah, I would say for sure that the rules that they had before the pandemic are their only point of reference for what to do now. And for a lot of kids, it takes multiple tries and a lot of practice and years of learning to get to that next step. And then other kids can see it one time and they're fine. But yeah, it doesn't help also that they're getting information from other sources that have no direct influence on their actual life, what's actually going on. Like, I'm thinking of social media has given you this rule. I need to buy $500 worth of clothes online and have that in my closet in order to feel a certain way. And that's based off of only online, and it's not based on what is actually happening in their life. And you have to be able to, well, it's a skill to be able to tell what's a rule that's applicable to me and what's a rule that's just online. Is this actually going to help me feel better about myself? And it takes trial and error. And
well, yeah. It does. It takes that level of maturity above where most of high school students would be already anyway under ideal circumstances, let alone when all of their body of evidence that they're using to create an idea of maturity is flawed as well. Right. So to themselves within their peer groups, yeah, they're the hero for the day. They're the hero for the week, whatever. Outside those peer groups, all of the adults in their room are scratching their heads and going like, who gave you cocaine at lunchtime? Like, you guys need to calm down. The amount of times that I've had to tell students like, look, I don't care how you play outside of here. If all of you guys are cousins and you guys fight each other at home, bare knuckle boxing style, like whatever, that's your home. But there are boundaries here. There are rules here. Right. So like, no, hands off of each other. They play like early middle schoolers, but they're 2 years older and they're bigger and it's dangerous now. Right. There was a former student of mine got jumped in the hallways to where like he was getting his head stomped on. And I had to remind people like, look, that's the closest we've come to having a student actually die in our hallways in a long time. Because all it takes is the wrong stomp in the wrong spot and you've got a brain hemorrhage. And they don't see that because that's what they see in social media. They see the TikTok reel where someone does that to defend their neighborhood, and then they don't see the repercussions of that on either side.
And the rule that they've come up with is if someone wrongs you, this is what you should do, without thinking about the actual rule that's in place, which is you will go to jail forever. So it's not related to what they're actually dealing with in their day-to-day life.
Or the fact that most instances, it's not moral to respond to violence with violence. Yeah. Right. It can be.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
Sometimes it is the answer, but on the whole, like, no. If someone pushes you, pushing them back doesn't de-escalate the situation and make it better. It makes it worse. All right, let's go ahead and I'm going to close this out and we can get back in.
All right, quick break. Do you want to guess what I did on our little break?
What did you did on your little break?
I checked my phone.
Yeah.
I checked Twitter. I checked Instagram.
Because we're never bored.
Not for 1 second. Yeah. Truly aware of the, is that irony? I don't know. Because we're not saying like you should never get on social media, you need to quit, blah, blah, blah. Just pointing out that it can be harmful for developing brains.
Yeah, in which, to lead to our primary topic before we run out of time, I think between the two of us, we read the better part of a dozen academic papers on the topic, plus whatever psychology of exceptionalities training that we've both have had, because I know I've had to take a couple classes on that, being an educator. I'm assuming that having 2 degrees in psychology, you're more than just familiar with some of these things, especially because you deal with them in your behavioral therapy practice. So how does social media and ADHD, how do they operate together?
One of the big barriers to studying this topic is that by the time you publish your research on social media, it's already out of date and it's not relevant anymore. So if you're looking at social media research from even last year, it's not going to apply today because it's changing too quickly. So there's not a lot of definitive, really good research that says this is what this platform does, because by the time you finish, even by the time you finish like your sample, if you're doing like a 2-month, check-in or a test retest, by the time you retest, things are different. So with the caveat that it's really hard to tell what the effect is because of how quickly these platforms merge and change and get sold and have new features. But it should be kind of the same, but it's hard to say.
Yeah, I was gonna interject there for a moment, but I wanted to let you finish your thought. That another thing that plagues the social sciences, especially these past 10 to 20 years, is we're operating in the realm of hypotheses and theories that, because we have, and I don't want to make it sound like humanity knows what's going on because we've got no freaking clue, but we have enough foundational knowledge in these subjects to where most of what we're trying to find evidence to refute or validate. Okay, I don't want to make it sound like we shop for evidence, right? But we have these intuitions about hypotheses based on the limited evidence that we've seen beforehand. And so we gather more evidence to see if that hypothesis is correct. And oftentimes in the social sciences, and we see this a lot in sociology and stuff like that, is that most of the evidence is anecdotal or self-reported, which makes it really tricky as well. So before we continue, let me ask you this, because I should have, but I didn't look at the chapter about it in my Neuroscience of Adolescence book. For a accurate and, let's just say accurate, for an accurate diagnosis of ADHD, what is happening in the brain physiologically? Is there a neurochemical difference between the statistically normal brain, right? Trying to take the positive valence off of the word normal and just say the mathematical average brain. Is there a physiological difference between that and the ADHD brain? And if so, what is it?
Man, so there's research to support both, but for what most psychologists are doing is diagnosing the behavior pattern that you see, and what is happening in the brain is really inaccessible to us and our diagnostic tools as far as money and research. Theoretically, if you put people who have ADHD in an MRI machine and ask them questions, make them do a test, just have them sit there quietly, their pattern would look different than someone without ADHD. But when you sit down and you go through the DSM-5 checklist, you're only looking at what they physically do with their body and touching on a little bit of thought patterns, but chemically, it's not that relevant to diagnosing. And the key that we want to do is identify children and adults who are at some sort of disadvantage in their life because of their ADHD, and they need support or a support worker and medication. And so I like to think pragmatic reasons, we just diagnose based off of the behavior so that it's quicker and these people get the resources that they need, even if it errs on the side of overdiagnosing.
Okay. Two things on that, and not to turn this into a grill session or hold your feet too close to the fire, but two things. First of all, your comment about patterns of behavior makes me think about an idea I've been playing with this week in preparation for this, that many human experiences exist on a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can have anxiety, you can be anxious, but not having an anxiety attack. Mm-hmm. You can be depressed, but not be in a depressive episode. Right? So there is a range of manifesting those experiences. And I think that we are a little too quick to try and recognize or diagnose variance within the mathematical average of that spectrum, right? Because for all intents and purposes, we have no idea what the ideal mindset would be, especially given the fact that our social environments that our mindsets are evolved for are constantly changing. Second thing, if the neuropharmacology isn't practicable for diagnosing, then why medication? Because isn't the whole point of medication to adjust your neuropharmacology so that way you have more constrained behavioral outbursts?
Yeah, let's see. If you're going to treat depression, you would give an SSRI, which increases the amount of serotonin available to your neurons in your brain, which increases mood. But the type of medication for ADHD is like stimulants and amphetamines, which kind of globally makes the brain function a little bit better, a little bit quicker for everybody. It doesn't matter if you have ADHD or not, those medications will help you. That's the point. They're stimulants. It's like super caffeine. So if you're focused after having caffeine, you'd definitely be focused after taking an ADHD medication. So and this is more opinion, they help because they're stimulants and they're not really addressing if there is an underlying neurochemical issue. It's really just ignoring that.
Okay,
which
so
might be an issue.
Correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but it kind of sounds like rather than addressing neurochemical irregularity, it is supposed to act as a tool to help that person moderate their own behavior.
Correct.
Okay.
It's because I'm also, a behavior analyst. So ADHD is very much a behavioral disorder before it is like a neurological or psychological disorder. Number one, because of the diagnostic criteria, we're not doing blood tests to diagnose it. We're not doing brain imaging. We're not trialing things like SSRIs that if you have severe depression and an SSRI works, you know for sure that you had depression and you had a chemical imbalance because the SSRI worked. You have more serotonin available in your brain, therefore you feel better. And there's not a way to do that with ADHD. Therefore, it is purely behavioral. And in the future, that might change. It might be neurological. It might be genetic. There might be something else there, but right now with how we diagnose and how we treat, just behavior, which people don't like to hear for some reason. I guess they want it to be more than that. And it can be kind of tough news to realize, your brain is, as far as we know, it's working just fine. And that might not always be true, but right now that's how our healthcare system is set up.
That makes me wonder, and this is pure speculation. I don't have any study in front of me to back this claim up. This is just one of those intuitive hypotheses. It makes me wonder if the mimicry environment of social media and the valorization of being divergent, abnormal, without the negative valence, just again, statistically or mathematically speaking, we do have a prevailing innocence and purity falsely equivocated with victimhood in Western culture. And that can be interpreted a whole lot of ways. I'm sure in some of our future episodes we'll interpret that more like sociopolitically, but I'm thinking more personally and practically in this instant with regards to mental health. We have, as a culture, started breaking down some of the stigmas with mental health, as we rightly should, right? If you have a neurodivergence, if you have unique needs, we are in a position as a first world society and a compassionate culture to be able to help. Right? We're not going to like tailor the entire world so that way you don't have to have a disruptive experience in life, but like we can help. That's what you and I do as professions, right? Is to help.
Which is why we want to identify these people. And
right. So that way, like for example, if I have a student in my class that is not going to learn the standards presented the way that 90% of the class will learn the standards, me as their educator needs to know that. So that way we call it differentiation. I can present the same content. I can have them do the same task, but tailor it to their, whether they're a visual learner or an auditory learner or a tactile learner or something like that. Right. They might not be good with expressing themselves vocally, but they might be great with the written word or artistically or something like that. Right. And I can differentiate to where they're demonstrating the same mastery level of the same core content, just in a different mode of expression. But I think an unintended incentive structure that we are creating for that is people want to feel special. And part of the way that they can get rewarded for being special is claiming this label of, I have this additional struggle. I'm neurodivergent, which they very well could be. I mean, I think for all intents and purposes, everybody except for that one person that's at the actual mathematical average point of human experience, everybody else by definition is neurodivergent from that one person. But
yeah,
they're and I think social media might be a ticket to this, and especially in our youth, they are falsely equivocating the virtue of being victimized by something outside of their control, such as ADHD, anxiety disorders, depression, and they're more, to be softer about this, they're more prone to self-diagnosing those things, because what happens in their peer group, right? They can come out and say, hey, I have anxiety disorders, I need help with this, or I go see that person, which if they do, they need to, but then all their friends go, you're so stunning and brave, look at you, right? You're getting that social reward for that. And so all of your other friends that are in the classroom that are managing decently but still have to struggle because you're a teenager, you're looking around going, well, where's my social reward for showing up today? And we'll let them know you're normative, you don't get the special reward.
The other problem is a person with a diagnosed, like clinically significant levels of anxiety, they need medication, they need help. Everyone has experienced anxiety and can relate to that person describing a panic attack, that person describing a stressful situation, and that's why mental health disorders are so difficult to diagnose, because there is a healthy level of anxiety to live with, and then there's a clinically significant level of anxiety that is difficult to live with. And somewhere along that line you get diagnosed, and somewhere below that line you don't get diagnosed. And so you can't, everyone knows what it's like to have anxiety. Everyone knows what it's like to have, well, depression might be a little different. But
no, but everybody's been sad. Right. And so everybody's tiptoed around that hole of depression. Whether they've actually found themselves like 10 feet down without a ladder is a different story. But everybody has, life is hard, right? Life is by definition tragic. And at some point, everybody's going to have to bear that burden, to bear, not to get back to the religious text, but to bear that cross of that tragedy, right? And find coping skills and self-regulation mechanisms to help them come out of that episode at least at the same level they were before, if not, hopefully a little bit better.
And I think people would recognize those symptoms in themselves and then want to get diagnosed or want to identify with that diagnosis when those symptoms at a certain level would be normal. And it's the same thing with ADHD, where a person, if you are given a stimulant medication and extra time on the test and extra breaks throughout your day, you're going to be a very good student versus what you were doing before. So you will see improvement no matter what if everyone is given the same help that students with ADHD might get. And it can be a little bit of a confirmation bias to say, I have ADHD because when I get extra time on my tests and when I take Ritalin beforehand, I do really well. And it's like, yes, of course you do. Anyone would do well with those. That's the point. And it's pretty similar with anxiety as well. If you take a Xanax, you're going to go a little numb. You're not going to feel anxious anymore. That airplane flight is going to be really easy. And I think the question that people need to ask themselves not is, do I identify with these symptoms, but am I experiencing a clinically significant level of these symptoms? And a lot of times the answer is going to be, no, I'm pretty good. Or yes, and I'm going to seek out this help.
But we're ignoring two things with that. First of all, is that social currency that they might get. Secondly, and I didn't think about this until you just brought it up, the instant reward. Because who wants to deal with anxiety? Well, any reasonable person is going to say no. We might, those of us that are deeper thinkers might understand that there's that need for it. If people aren't anxious enough, they're self-destructive. Right? They don't plan for the future. They're not like, oh, jumping off this 40-foot cliff might kill me if I hit that rock below, right? They just jump, right? They don't get that little bit of nervousness.
Even little stuff like, I don't care if I'm late for work. Who cares?
Yeah.
Versus
right.
that anxiety of like, I'm going to disappoint someone. Yeah.
Yeah. Too little is just as disruptive to a healthy lifestyle as too much. But what have many of us been conditioned to do? There's an external solution, right? So rather than working on our coping skills, rather than working on our self-regulation mechanisms, we do what my teenagers do. Oh, I'm coming down with a little bit of a cough. Where's the medicine? Like, bro, if you just have a cough because there's pollen outside, like, you have to just deal with it. You can't experience a problem in your life and then switch providers, switch regions, take a pill, do whatever, get modifications, and all of a sudden that problem goes away. No, it might go away temporarily, but it's just like, that would be the same as in that story of Exodus that I told earlier. Instead of getting the inoculation through exposure therapy, they were just given a whole bunch of anti-venom to where they were still susceptible to the venom and its toxin. But they had enough to where they could just be like, oh, you're feeling ill? There you go. there's your anti-venom, now you're good to go, rather than actually facing it down and inoculating themselves to where it has no effect on them anymore.
I'll never forget, this was pre-pandemic, and I had walking pneumonia twice in the same month. And the second time I went to the doctor, I was like, I have walking pneumonia again, take my blood, whatever. They did, still had the bacteria, and they didn't give me antibiotics. And I was like, dude, what the hell? Like, the antibiotics didn't work the first time. I need them again. And they didn't give me them. They gave me a inhaler, some good old albuterol, which does not treat chest infections. And they sent me on my way, and I was pissed. And then the reasoning that they gave me was that the antibiotics didn't work, so we're not doing them again. You're just going to have to fight this on your own. And that's what I did. And it sucks to hear that.
It's like having the flu.
But it has to be done. Yeah.
Right. You go to the flu and you're like, hey, cure me. And they're like, no, we can't. But here's a whole bunch of stuff to help with your symptoms. Tough it out for 3 days. You'll get better. Yeah.
Yeah. So I used my inhaler for like 2 months, and I haven't had walking pneumonia since because of the pandemic.
Well,
I've been very healthy.
And I'm certain too that natural inoculation that way is going to help in the long run.
Ooh, yeah. I really empathize with people who don't want to hear that you have to work through it. Sorry. We have a pill, but we're not giving it to you. Because
no one wants to hear that.
It sucked. But it took a tough doctor, because I was literally told them, like, I want the antibiotics, and they held strong and didn't give them to me. And I lived. But yeah, it takes someone along the line to put your foot down.
We could take this in a very political turn, and I'm not going to, because I don't think I'm ready for that yet. I need to do a little bit more reading, but let's just put a pin in this, that what your doctor gave you was not affirmative care. He did not affirm your position and cater to what you thought you needed. He made a medically advisable decision that went against how you felt you should have been treated. And that's very, very, very politically relevant right now, but I don't want to dive into that topic.
It is,
Not yet. If you know what I'm talking about, then you'll know that, it's touchy. And, maybe we could do that later on when we're both better equipped to compassionately and justly navigate those murky waters. But let's just stick with the controversial topic we've already picked for today and not dive into too much. So everything that we just said in the past 20 minutes has been leading up to the at best correlation, at worst causation of increasing prevalence of ADHD diagnoses and social media usage. Now, I did find in fact, it was the CDC has a chart of rates of ADHD diagnoses in the US. We can argue how accurate that data is or not. It doesn't particularly matter. It's the probably highest tier level data that we have easy access to. So that's the ones we're going to use. That whole self-reporting and all of that stuff kind of throws a wrench into it. People that live outside of their sample areas that throw off the numbers because of, their lived experience, that's another entirely. But what it did show is that it is on the rise proportionately, especially in the past 10 to 15 years. And especially with specific age groups and demographics. So being an educator in high school, I primarily looked at the adolescent years and their numbers because those are particularly germane to what I deal with every day. And two things that I noticed: that yes, it is on the rise, but first of all, you can look at the percentage rise from the age group of like 4 to 8, 10 to 14, and then 14 to 17. And the biggest percentage or the group that had the highest percentage was the 14 to 17, followed very closely by the 10 to 14 age group. And I'm going to give my theory as to why in just a second. I need to explain point number 2. Point number 2 was that in females, the diagnoses was up like 5.9 or 6.2% compared to what it had been. That number was doubled to 12.9% among young boys. Now, here's my hypothesis as to why. Because of everything we've talked about earlier about needing a quick fix and the social currency and getting out of stuff, right? You get out of the normal homework if you have modifications needed. Coupled with puberty means that we are, as a society, too hastily, or at least it appears that we might be too hastily diagnosing human beings that are at the proper age, that are having the normal human response to like 1,000% increase into their free body testosterone levels, because that's what testosterone does to the body. That's why teenage boys starting in middle school start getting scatterbrained. They can't focus on one particular thing. They have boundless energy, or they're dead ass asleep. It's always one or the other. There's no in between. Right? Because those are all symptoms of injecting testosterone into that system, right? It spurs muscle growth. It spurs energy to spur that muscle growth and to raise metabolism, right? So that muscle growth is metabolically costly, which is why they're asleep all the time. It spurs their metabolism to grow that muscle, which is why they have all the energy when they're not asleep. Distractedness, because they're spending metabolic energy growing all of their things. Scatterbrained and unable to focus on one thing. Again, all of that is downstream effects of natural processes that they're going through. Now, factor in all of the things that we talked about with social media beforehand, and I think I don't want to come across as sounding like I'm trying to explain away the increasing prevalence of ADHD as simply byproducts of the time that we live in, because we very well could be evolutionarily increasing the prevalence of ADHD, genetics, or however else it's tracked, right? But at least part of that increase, I would be willing to bet money on, is because of those factors. Or let me be grammatically correct. I would bet money that the increasing prevalence and symptoms are because of those factors.
I think one of the problems is we don't have a blood test for ADHD. We only have the way that people act. And if you put a teenage boy in a room without windows for 8 hours and ask him to work quietly, you're going to see some ADHD symptoms, because fidgeting, talking to people, interrupting, inattentiveness, acting out straight up, like behavioral issues, all of those things will come from the environment that they're placed in. And that's a whole nother issue on top of puberty and all of those chemical things that you just talked about. And then asking that same child who's going through all of this to transition from, you have PE and you have recess and you have free time and you have playtime in the classroom, to you spend 50 minutes in here, 5 minutes in the hall, 50 minutes in here, 5 minutes in the hall, and working your way to the end of the day like that, instead of having those more natural play breaks, even though elementary school isn't that much better. But all of those things occur at the same time, and the result is children who act a certain way, and some of those behaviors will meet the behavioral criteria for ADHD, which is how it's diagnosed right now. And whether or not that person has a different brain is, we'll never know. Eventually, I'm sure you'll be able to sit down and just smile for the camera, and it will be able to tell you if you have ADHD or not. But for now, that's what we have to go on.
Which is probably going to be terrifying.
Yeah. So what we're seeing is an increase of people acting this way. And then you have to ask yourself, why are people behaving in this way more than they were 10 years ago? And one of the reasons could be social media, it could be how school is done, it could be our diet, could be standardized testing.
As someone that's in the school system, I don't think, if anything, the changes that we've made in the school system arguably should be negating a lot of those behavioral changes, because that's part of what spurred we didn't see the downstream effects of it in my generation when I was going through public school. But I think your generation started seeing a lot of that, and I'm definitely embedded in it now, for good or ill. Now, part of me is concerned because I think to some level the way that we have the high schoolers especially have their day organized for them, 50 minutes, 5 minutes, 90 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever, I think that is modeling. They don't have executive function yet, not until they get juniors and seniors, right? They have no way to organize their life. They don't have the discipline and executive function to practice an organizational system for more than a week at a time, which, if you're practicing organizational systems a week at a time, is just scratching the surface on seeing of whether that's going to work for you or not, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of that hidden value in there that we're glossing over as we try to rapidly change education to match with the social environments that we're in, with social media and stuff like that, is where we don't know how much of the baby we're throwing out with that bathwater. Mm-hmm. Right. And this goes back to, we talked a little bit about that tradition piece as a starting point for interacting with reality. And then you modify it from there. If they don't have a toolkit to start with, then they have to make their own tools. And they already can't sit still and use the tools that we're giving to them, right? Which is why we have classrooms, so they can learn how, and they can have those mistakes and experiment with them, right? So if we take all of that away and say, oh yeah, we don't have a toolkit for you because that's oppressive tradition, and you have to figure out a way to make your own tools, and we're not going to tell you how to do it because that would be discriminatory and imposing our existing system on top of you, what the hell are they supposed to do except for fidget and get locked in their phones?
The other thing is, if let's say they have all of these symptoms and then they're given extra time on a test and they're given medication and everyone says, I know you're trying your best, and they get a lot of positive feedback and some empathy, the incentive to say, I don't have ADHD actually, it's not there, which it's fine. It doesn't have to be there. Who cares if they're diagnosed? It's not a huge burden on our healthcare system. If everyone is diagnosed with ADHD and everyone is given, these resources, it's not a huge deal. There are disorders that would be a huge deal that we wouldn't want to overdiagnose, but I think ADHD is okay, in my opinion, to overdiagnose and identify these people who might benefit from extra time, a quiet environment, recorded lectures so that they can go back and review, getting notes from someone else, and then medication on top of all of that. I think those things are awesome. I would like them.
Yeah, true. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. Let's wrap this up this way. How do you feel about, this is an academic article that I read that made the claim that the most watched videos in, like, this one was for YouTube, but I'm certain it would apply to like TikTok too and stuff like that. The most watched and trending videos are the ones that have the least accurate information. Right. Especially with regards to self-diagnoses. That was the point of this article, is that people looking for YouTube videos about ADHD symptoms all aggregated towards the ones that had the least accurate information.
Yeah, in just like passing experience, I have noticed that the videos that come across my feeds are weirdly inaccurate. People saying like, do you have a poor sense of time, and do you only eat sugary foods? You probably have ADHD. It's like,
you just labeled 90% of America.
Right. And then the rationale is, you have a poor sense of time and you only eat sugary foods because your executive function is XYZ. And when you get diagnosed with ADHD, they don't ask about your executive function. That's not, it's very difficult for me to go by and see these things. And I think the reason is confirmation bias and the fact that the list of behaviors that would get you diagnosed with ADHD is pretty boring. You've seen it before. I would not sit down and watch a video on it because it's old news. But if you tell me something new, something different, then that one would be interesting. And I might sit down if I'm wondering, do I have ADHD? I notice these symptoms in myself. I hate going to school. I don't like doing my homework. I find it very difficult. And then you see these symptoms that you've never heard of before that are more concrete and that you recognize in yourself. I can see someone watching those videos.
Plus, I think shopping around for the list that you feel best suits you without doing rigorous self-analysis and adjusting your list to more accurately represent the behaviors trends people towards. It's a combination of that confirmation bias and self-selected echo chambers.
Yeah, I think probably the worst video I've seen was a guy who has ADHD, and he was explaining something he called waiting mode, which is when you have a task later in the day, you can't do anything else until that and you can't do anything else with your day or with your time. And all of the comments were, oh my gosh, this happens to me. I must have ADHD. And this guy's personal experience, however valid, he wants to talk about it. What he actually has just done is convinced 500 teenagers that maybe I have ADHD. And
when in actuality,
12-year-olds,
they're just bored for 10 minutes waiting for the bus.
Right. And they can't do anything until this task is done. Or, oh, I have a package arriving. I'm really excited for it. I keep thinking about it. Like, yes, because it's exciting.
What about this?
Yeah.
Not to cut you off there, but keeping with the social media piece, another article I read suggested that social media use, problematic social media use, increased ADHD symptoms over time, whereas the intensity of social media use did not.
Does problematic refer to like you should be studying, but you use it?
I think it's more along the lines of either participating in or receiving social conflict.
Oh, like I argue with people. Oh, yeah. That's very interesting. I think we talked about how last episode, how tics can be contagious through the internet. And it absolutely would not surprise me if certain ADHD symptoms are contagious through the internet as well, because you see someone else do it. And maybe you were already doing it, and then it becomes more salient and something you think about, and you end up doing it more. That's like when you realize you're biting your nails. It's so hard to stop.
Yeah.
And you might do it more.
I think
same
part
kind
of
of
that
phenomenon.
is because, and we'll wrap this up really quick because we got less than a minute, and I'll let you get final words if we can squeeze them in. But the human brain is incapable of thinking of the negative. Right. So if you find yourself biting your nails, you say, don't bite your nails. What's the first thing you think of is biting your nails. Right. So I say, don't think of an elephant. What's the first thing you think of? An elephant. Right. It gets planted in the brain that way. Yeah. Whereas if you would rephrase that and say, instead of don't bite your nails, do something else. Right. You can manifest that do something else behavior. Right.
Yeah.
So anything else you want to say on this topic before we wrap it up? And we'll probably do a part 3, a couple topics later from now, because I think we want to move on and explore different things, but floor's yours.
Yeah. I think the main thing is if I call ADHD a behavioral issue and a set of ways that people act, that's not to take away from that diagnosis, and that it's just meant to describe it as best as I can and not try and change the way you feel towards it. Just trying to be as accurate as I can with the information that we go with. Yeah, no hard feelings.